Good morning, everyone. My name is Rory O'Connell, Professor of Human Rights and Constitutional Law here in the School of Law and Transitional Justice Institute, Ulster University. Welcome to you all. We're really delighted to have the two commissions here with us this morning. A few housekeeping announcements for you. Just to say we are not having any fire drills today. So if the fire alarm does go off, you do have to leave, I'm afraid. But hopefully that won't happen. We have bathrooms, female bathrooms are just here on the right as you leave. And then the male bathrooms are further along back, just near the lifts at the reception area where there was tea and coffee. Just a reminder, in this room, only bottled water is allowed, no tea, coffee, or food. And then the emergency exits are just by the stairwell immediately outside if they are needed. That housekeeping out of the way, really delighted to have you all here today. We're in our moot courtroom. And our moot courtroom in the School of Law, which was very much the brainchild of my colleague Kieran White, who I see here in the audience, exemplifies some of the great features about our law school at Ulster, that we're really committed to giving our students practical insight into the working of the law and to the practice of the law. We're not just about ivory tower academics and blue sky thinking, but very much about how we live and work and contribute to our society. And that's another great theme of our work in the law school, in TJI, and in Ulster University, that we are a civic institution. We are committed to our community and the wider communities that we serve. And so it is a great pleasure to work with different commissions in different capacities, and to welcome you this morning for this event. So, having said our welcomes, I'm going to hand over to the commissions. I'm not sure, is it Alison Kirkpatrick from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission.
Good morning, everyone. Really delighted to have you here and to have you online. There's so many faces in the room that I recognise who've been working in this probably as long as we have, and also online. Really great representation, so we're thrilled that you're still interested and that you're going to share your information with us and give Geraldine and Roisin and Claire a hard time on the questions and answers. I should simply be directing. Thank you, Rory, for hosting us, and to the University of Ulster. When I walked in here, it took me back to my first day as a bar student, and I have to say I got the heebie-jeebies completely. I was trying to pretend that I had it in me to stand in front of a judge, so it took me right back. I feel for the students who are having to pretend to be barristers again. The launch of this report, another annual report, is a very important moment for us because it allows us to reflect on the implementation of the Windsor Framework Article 2 over the last year. And our casework has been particularly significant. Perhaps the most significant development has been the endorsement by the High Court that Windsor Framework Article 2 is an important protection for rights post-Brexit, and that it was always meant to be that protection for rights post-Brexit. It wasn't a mistake. Both the commissions intervened in the case brought by the victims and families to challenge the Legacy Act. That was our second foray into the High Court. The court gave a lot of consideration to the case and delivered a very long judgment. We also took our own motion, so that means in our own name, challenged the Illegal Migration Act, which was also successful before the High Court. And throughout the process in relation to both, we had raised significant concerns about the compliance of the legislation with the UK's human rights obligations, including Windsor Framework Article 2, as they progressed through Parliament. Our concerns were not addressed, and therefore we had no option but to proceed to litigation. It's a step we take as a last resort rather than a first. However, it's been fruitful. The High Court judgments in both Legacy and IMA cases found a breach of the Windsor Framework and the Human Rights Act. And just to give you a very brief summary of the key findings, I could break these down really quickly. First, that the fundamental rights are central to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which we in this room all know. That the rights protected under Article 2 are broad in scope and cannot be limited to the political context of 1998. That was up for debate, but the court has now made it clear. We understand why in this room, I think, but it was an argument that was put before the High Court. The rights of victims and rights of asylum seekers are encompassed in the Rights, Safeguards and Equality of Opportunity chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. EU law set minimum standards prior to the UK exit against which there should be no diminution, and that asylum seekers are part of the community in Northern Ireland and have protections under Article 2. And I have to say I'm particularly proud of that last finding, because I think it sums up what the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was all about and what we are supposed to be about, which is making sure protections for each and every person, not dependent on their status or when they arrived. Crucially, the High Court also disapplied provisions of Westminster legislation that conflicted with Windsor Framework Article 2. Now, this was seen as controversial when the judgment came out from the court, but it is stated in the text. That's exactly what they said it was supposed to do. We're pleased the judgments so far have confirmed our analysis of Windsor Framework Article 2. A little bit self-satisfied, but it's been reassuring because there's an awful lot of work and complication that goes into this. I really want to acknowledge, some of you in the room, the support of civil society stakeholders in particular, and your willingness to work with us in those cases. And in the IMA case, we simply couldn't have done it without you. You provided supporting evidence and affidavits, and those were essential in helping us build our case, but also in conveying to the court what's really at stake here, that this is about real people and real suffering. So thank you for that. We do encourage you to review and pursue the issues raised in this report within your areas of expertise. We'd love you to engage on the issues and engage with us. We want to make more progress. We want to ensure future recommendations are implemented and as targeted as possible, and we really do rely on you for that. And I think we do work pretty well together, so let's try and keep going in that direction. We do note that since finalising the report, we've had a change of government. Self-evident. There is a distinct change of tone in relation to human rights, which is welcomed. It's still early days. Over the last few years, we have been very concerned about the rollback of rights. It is reassuring to have commitments from the Prime Minister confirming that the UK will not leave the ECHR, for example. I never thought I'd have to say that. The Secretary of State has also confirmed the government is fully committed to Article 2 Windsor Framework and to upholding the UK's obligations post-Brexit. Something, again, which should be self-evident, but perhaps which wasn't. Nevertheless, I think we must continue to monitor it closely. The UK government has announced it's no longer appealing the High Court finding that the conditional immunity provisions within the Legacy Act are in breach of the procedural obligations of Article 2, the right to life under the European Convention, and we greatly welcome that. The Secretary of State has confirmed that he will continue, however, to appeal the decision that provisions of the Legacy Act are in breach of Windsor Framework Article 2, as well as other ECHR grounds. So we're not finished yet. Given the novelty of the non-diminution commitment, we do recognise, and we always did, that there is real value in having the Court of Appeal clarify the law in this area. So we're not surprised it's going on appeal, we're not disappointed, but we do intend to maintain our ground. We were, however, and this is a note of more negativity perhaps, deeply concerned by the approach taken by the previous government in the appeal, and a little concerned that maybe there hasn't been as much disassociation from that approach as we would have hoped. The previous approach taken by the previous government was what's described, we would describe as a full-throated challenge to the validity of the Windsor Framework Article 2 at every level. The government initially argued that a litigant could not rely on Article 2 before the courts. It then made the case it could only be relied on before the courts in the most marginal of cases, so as to render the commitment void of any real substance. We argued strenuously against the interpretation. We said it was contrary to public commitments from ministers at the time. The withdrawal agreement was signed into law, and its own explainer on Windsor Framework Article 2. Now, we await the outcome of the appeal, and we'll have to look at that closely once we get it. Our duties include to litigate when necessary, but that's only one of our functions. We take a very strategic approach, We're pleased that it's been vindicated in these cases, but there's still much to do and much to be determined by the courts, and our research and policy work is essential to informing these issues. So the research is just as important, sits alongside, in many cases, informs our litigation. Our annual report highlights the range of issues which we've identified as falling within the scope of Windsor Framework Article 2. It does provide an overview of our key advice and recommendations, and also on implementation more generally. So I would encourage you to read the whole report. I know it seems quite thick and daunting, but it's a surprisingly easy read. It covers issues which, while they overlap with the non-diminution commitment, are more generally framed as rights after Brexit. We primarily target our advice at the Northern Ireland Executive and the UK Government, obviously. And I know we have a varied audience in the room and online. From the Assembly and Parliament, departmental officials, politicians, community and voluntary sector, other statutory bodies, civil society. So we really do speak to everybody when we launch these reports. We know the report has wider utility for a range of our stakeholders, and it's still important for people to get a sense of what Windsor Framework Article 2 really means and what it means in practice and its utility. Most people will come to the report and read those sections which most interest them. We know that. We've tried to make each as self-determining as possible, as complete as possible. There will be overlap, and we do ask you to read it all if you can find your way to do it, because it does put it all in context and it does cross-refer. Ensuring Article 2 is considered in the development of law and policy is going to take leadership. So again, to leaders out there in the room and online, we're looking at what you do. It's going to take guidance and training. We hope to see it, both in the devolved context and at a UK level. So we look forward to engaging positively with the new government, new Secretary of State, and with the Northern Ireland Executive on this. And of course, building on the relationships which we have already formed with all of you. And on that, I'm going to, rather than take up any more time, hand over to Geraldine, who's going to say some more words about our annual report. And we'll proceed to the question and answer session just after that.
We had a bit of a joke earlier about who was bigger and who wasn't. Maybe it's right that I'm maybe bigger than I thought I was in more ways than one. Anyway, good morning, everyone. Just want to add my welcome to that of Alison's. It's great to see you all here in the room and online. But we're here to launch this third annual report. And for those of you who maybe know me, I get a little bit impatient about lack of progress, except, of course, when it comes to me personally. But, you know, I'm impatient for change. I get frustrated by the lack of movement. And there are times I sit and I think we're not getting anywhere very fast. But when you've just listened to Alison and you see the report, I have to admit that I'm wrong. There has been much work done by both commissions. Alison has already told you about the legal work that has been ongoing and how that has shown the strength and the reach of the Article 2 commitments. And by the way, when I refer to Article 2, I'm purely talking about the Windsor Framework Article 2, just to save a bit of time. So our annual survey has shown that there's great support for the protection of rights and equalities post-Brexit here in Northern Ireland, and it remains very strong. Overwhelmingly, 74% of respondents consider the equality and human rights protections in the Windsor Framework are important to them. But briefly looking back to recommendations in our last report, while there has been some movement in progressing some of the recommendations from our first report, it is still disappointing that most of the recommendations are only partially progressed and some not at all. But let's be optimistic if we can. We are in a new place. We have a functioning executive. We have a new government at Westminster. And there is a real opportunity for a change in the direction of travel. There is an opportunity for the Northern Ireland Executive and the UK government to show in a real meaningful and practical way that there is a genuine commitment to complying with the Article 2 obligations. They must further embed Article 2 consideration into policy making at the earliest possible stage. We do welcome that there's been some progress in this area. For example, in July of 23, The Executive Office published an Article 2 impact assessment as part of its consultation on the draft strategic framework to end violence against women and girls. However, we're yet to see this approach replicated by other consultations in other departments, but the Executive Office has shown that it can be done, and it must be the norm across the whole of government. Again, we welcome that some Article 2 training and guidance for Northern Ireland departmental officials has been implemented, but there's again more to be done. And at the UK level, there have been very small steps, but more comprehensive training and guidance on Article 2 has not been rolled out across Whitehall. There has been insufficient consideration given to Article 2 compliance in relation to government bills that impact on Northern Ireland. You've already heard that from Alison's presentation. We know there has been updated Cabinet Office guidance referencing Article 2 compliance, but that alone is not enough. We need all new legislation to be accompanied by explanatory notes and human rights memoranda or impact assessments which set out in detail how they have taken Article 2 considerations into account. It's clearly not the case, as set out in the UK Government's command paper on safeguarding the Union, that the Windsor Framework applies only in respect of the trade in goods, and that the vast majority of public policy is entirely untouched by it. I think you'll all agree with that. The legal cases that Alison has referred to over the last year have shown both the wide reach and the ramifications of Article 2 on policy making both here and at Westminster. Therefore, early and detailed consideration of Article 2 has to be properly embedded in policy and legislative development across the Northern Ireland Civil Service and Whitehall if the commitment to uphold rights and equalities is indeed to be met. We very much welcome the UK Government has stated its unwavering commitment to obligations under Article 2. Although the decision to appeal the High Court ruling regarding the Article 2 aspects of the legacy case does dent my confidence a little bit. However, we will be engaging with them to ensure that the commitment to adhere to Article 2 does indeed translate into the necessary action across government departments. As you can tell from the report, for those of you who've had the opportunity to look at it, there has been a significant amount of work undertaken by both commissions to fulfil our joint role in overseeing the Article 2 commitment. But I want to take a moment just to focus on a few areas of particular concern to the Equality Commission. We highlighted in our research into the experience of minority ethnic people last year that many ethnic minority and migrant people felt that racism was a normal part of everyday life. Many also reported feeling that their life here is more difficult after Brexit and that they are not a priority for government. And yet we've all seen this played out in the recent shocking events on our streets, and these have added to a renewed urgency to tackle racism and hate crime. We do recognise the correlation between increasing inequalities across our community and cuts in public spending, but this is no justification for the racism and the malicious behaviour we have witnessed. We have made a series of policy recommendations based on our research and after direct engagement with those affected. Many of those recommendations are included in this year's annual report. We have been clear about what needs to be done and done urgently to address some of these issues, including the strengthening of our race laws to address gaps in protection and tackling race hate crime and strengthening hate crime laws. We also make specific recommendations to address the real-life problems, such as access to public services, employment, cross-border healthcare and the EU settlement scheme, just to name but a few. A priority for us going forward will be raising these recommendations with the governments. The Article 2 commitment also has clear implications in terms of strengthening our laws here. I made that point yesterday to the Executive Office Committee, which many of you will know is undertaking an inquiry into gaps in equality law in Northern Ireland. In my evidence to the committee, I illustrated two examples of how Article 2 commitments in relation to keeping pace with changes to EU equality directives as set out in Annex 1 of the Windsor Framework can make real, tangible improvements to the lives of equality groups here in Northern Ireland. And the first example is the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Currently, unlike the rest of the UK and Ireland, there are no laws here requiring pay transparency reporting. If given effect in Northern Ireland law, it would help close the gender pay gap here and would go a long way towards improving employees' rights to compensation and increasing transparency and accountability. The new EU directives on binding standards for equality bodies is a second example. These will set out minimum standards that victims of discrimination can expect from equality bodies like the Commission, and how these bodies will be mandated to prevent discrimination, promote equal treatment, and assist victims of discrimination. But the Executive needs to take action to ensure the relevant improvements are made to our equality laws by the transposition deadline of June 26. Given effect to these directives will actually help avoid divergence of rights on the island of Ireland. And you'll recall that the whole ethos of the Good Friday Agreement was the convergence of rights across the island. And as EU law develops, the divergence of rights will grow. Both commissions, alongside the Irish Human Rights Commission, have commissioned an update to our last research report on the impact of Brexit on the divergence of rights and best practice on the island of Ireland, which we will be launching shortly. And I have to say we are grateful to our partners here in the University of Ulster, led by Rory O'Connell, who have undertaken that very valuable research. But other directives and legislation introduced by Europe, to which the Keeping Pace commitment does not apply, will have the same consequence of further divergence. These include the EU Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence and the EU Accessibility Act. These have the potential to benefit equality groups here, such as women, disabled people, and indeed older people. And we have called upon the UK Government and the Executive to ensure, on a voluntary basis, that our laws keep pace with changes such as these, where they strengthen the rights and reflect international human rights standards and best practices. I know that's pushing it a little bit, given the view expressed by government, but if we are serious about having a convergence of rights across the island, I believe it's something that the governments need to take into account. We also published research on the impact of Brexit on women and girls, and our associated policy recommendations will be published very shortly. But another area for us has been around the impact of the loss of EU funding on equality groups here. And the current round of funding under the Shared Prosperity Fund will end in March 25. It's really important we don't have a repeat of the shambles and the mistakes from the first rollout of the replacement of the funding. What we need to see is equality considerations at the heart of the next process. It's about putting people at the heart of policy. We have commissioned a follow-up piece of research to further investigate the loss of EU funding and its impact on the Section 75 groups, which we hope to publish early next year in advance of the closing date for the current round of funding. But before I close, I want to say that at the centre of all of this work are the groups and the individuals most affected by the changes brought about by Brexit. Some of those changes have made and continue to make real substantial impact on people's lives, and we take that engagement and input really seriously. We have worked hard over the last year to make sure that our recommendations reflect the needs and the lived reality of affected groups, whether that's disabled people, women and girls, minority ethnic communities, or voluntary and community groups reliant on EU funding. Our work has really benefited from engaging with and hearing from these groups, as well as those in the public sector, trade unions, and many, many others. And we want to thank those partners for engaging with us, helping us to shape the research and recommendations, and we will be raising these with the Northern Ireland Executive and the UK Government over the next year. But in conclusion, we are now 4 years on since the introduction of Article 2 commitments. Great strides have indeed been made in clarifying the scope and the effect of the Windsor Framework commitment to rights and equalities, both through our policy and research work as well as via the courts. Now we can look forward to working constructively with government to ensure that the consideration of Article 2 is built into the development of policy and legislation from the outset, so the commitment made to the people of Northern Ireland is indeed upheld across government as a priority. And thank you for listening.
So, this isn't on. Oh, it is on. We're going to move straight into the question and answer session. I think we have about 15, 20 minutes. We also have online participants who may want to ask some questions, and I think somebody is going to put their hand in the air and tell me if we have any of those. But we'll start in the room. You don't, not yet. So we have, just to be clear, we have Claire McCann, who, with her colleague Ailish Hockey, are the real brains behind this, and Roisin, the real brains behind it at the Equality Commission. I don't think Geraldine would mind me saying that we have two real experts here on the panel. Anyone who would like to ask a question, if you just indicate, and I'll direct them to the right person. You can ask me a question, but I don't advise it.
If that applies to Alison, it also applies to me.
Yes.
Hi, Emma.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's just here, yeah.
Emma Sheeran, Sinn Féin, MLA, some of you know me. I suppose my question's around, in the wake of Brexit, and particularly when you think in the discourse of the Windsor Framework, an awful lot of the public conversation has been around trade and regulations and difficulties and barriers that businesses and people have faced locally. And the rights issues haven't received the same prominence. And obviously, I just took a quick glance through your report there, but we've had many conversations around the rights deficit that the North is in, and where we need to come up to speed in terms of the rest of these islands. And I wonder what engagement you have had with those within the North who are blocking that, and where we can exert pressure there. I know there's reference, I keep talking about the Bill of Rights, and there's reference even in your recommendations to implementing the Bill of Rights, and that falls to the British government, but they then fall back on the fact that there's no political consensus in the North for that, and that's why it went nowhere. So I wondered how we can exert pressure there, or raise that conversation, and what conversations you are already having with those who would block within the executive.
Very quick overview, just in terms of the economy depends on strong rights protection for everyone within Northern Ireland, so you can't separate the two. We say one is dependent on the other. You're right, human rights were overlooked. We raised at every stage that they were equally important and that shouldn't be forgotten. I don't know whether, Roisin, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Emma, for the question. And divergence of rights on the island of Ireland has been a key focus of the Commission, both Commissions' work, including with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission as well, in terms of tracking and monitoring how Brexit has impacted on equality and human rights protections. So in terms of raising that, we've done a series of research reports, and Rory's doing the most recent one with colleagues at UU. But the first research report we've published that. We did policy recommendations arising out of that. We have been engaging with the Executive Office, with the Northern Ireland Office, and other relevant bodies as well in terms of raising those recommendations. Geraldine mentioned yesterday the TEO committee doing the inquiry in gaps equality law. We raised it at that. We said this is a key issue. We highlighted what Geraldine has mentioned about the EU Pay Transparency Directive and these standards for equality bodies directives as well as key areas that we consider that the UK government must keep pace with in terms of compliance with its obligations under the Windsor Framework Article 2. But just to say, there are a lot of other EU laws coming down the track that really would, if transposed into Northern Ireland law, would enhance protections here, such as Violence Against Women and Girls Directive, the EU Accessibility Act, the Gender Balance on Boards Directive. So they're in the report, but it's a really, really big issue that rights in Northern Ireland for equality and equality human rights don't fall behind other jurisdictions where they would strengthen rights and align with international human rights best practice and standards.
Don't know if that, yeah, it's from me on. There's been so much work done by yourself and the committee trying to develop a Bill of Rights and move it along, and we all contributed to that. And I think the only way forward is to keep plugging it, to keep trying to drive home the message that a Bill of Rights is for everyone, and there's so much benefit to be derived from it. Alison has already referred to the economic connections with it. We'll keep pushing it, and that's really all that I think I can add to it. You've done a lot of work. It has not been wasted. It's there, and hopefully the message will eventually get through, but I think it's a much wider issue as well.
One final point. Windsor Framework Article 2 is really important. It's really substantial. It has bite. We've seen that in terms of the High Court decision, but it's not a replacement for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. The committee did important work. We respect the work that they did. We're still calling for a Bill of Rights. We provided our advice in 2008, and we're still calling for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. So, thanks.
Do we have any others? Are we going to be forced to ask questions ourselves? There we go. There's one over here.
Kieran White, Ulster University and the Bar Library. I mean, this is just a thought that occurs to me, and just I'm looking for information, really. I see in the annual report you have a section, access to healthcare for migrants, quite rightly. And I just wondered where the Commission's thinking is at in relation to access to healthcare for what I might call Northern Ireland residents, measured pre-Brexit and post-Brexit, because of course one of the functions of the EU was, well, if the service wasn't available in your home territory, if we'll call it that, you could then, by various mechanisms, avail of it in another country. And the obvious kind of situation that we would have found ourselves in Northern Ireland would have been, well, the health service under crisis might not have the service in Belfast, but you might have been able to avail of it in Dublin. Those rights have certainly disappeared. And I can certainly think of one situation where administratively the service has also disappeared. So is there, any thoughts or consideration about that as a work module, perhaps, or maybe there's already work undergoing in relation to that within the commissions?
Yes, we've done quite a lot of research on it, and we have a couple of reports, I think, but I'm going to let Claire deal with that specific point.
Yeah, we have published research on the right to health and Windsor Framework Article 2. It's raised a number of issues, a lot of issues that we're aware of and that were brought to us as part of the engagement process. As part of that, I'm just mindful Ivanka has the microphone in her hand, and she's been doing a lot of this work for us. The work that we've done has identified a lot of issues in terms of accessing cross-border healthcare for people who are moving across border, to access healthcare and ensuring that those services are put in a valid and solid kind of legal framework moving forward. So we are looking at these issues, and we're very happy to engage with people if there's other issues that are coming forward and being identified that we can follow up on. We'd be very happy to do that as well. We're mindful of barriers to migrants who are accessing healthcare across borders, where they might have visa status in Northern Ireland and you're accessing an all-Ireland service in Ireland, what it means for family members, for example. So I'm just also mindful of the fact that the third committee has just recently published recommendations calling for, the kind of barriers to healthcare to be broken down, especially for ethnic minority people and migrants within jurisdictions. So there's a very competing streams about how we're working on this, but we're definitely looking at it. Thanks.
We also have a report on frontier workers, which I think we have copies of here, which also touches on health. Geraldine?
Yeah, just separate to the issue of cross-border workers or people who can only access healthcare in emergency, if you take in the Northwest, and access maybe at Galvin Hospital as opposed to anywhere else. Separate from that, referred to within the report, is some of the research and the stories that we learnt about whenever we went out round the various ethnic minority and migrant workers groups right across Northern Ireland. And there were some horrific stories about being asked before they could get any treatment of any sort, being asked to prove their residency. Cases of people who are from here on a temporary visa or on a work permit being denied treatment because they couldn't provide their reference number, their proper number. And one woman in particular who was terminally ill with stage 4 cancer was actually dispatched with paracetamol and told to go home. So I think there was an issue really about the level of training and awareness within our health systems about the rights of various individuals and how to treat those people with respect and dignity. What it mounted to really was a racial profiling of people who came in through the door of A&E and into doctor surgeries. So we were actually recommending that there would be much more work done in terms of educating frontline health workers and other service providers about the rights of individuals. So that's where that key recommendation was coming from.
Very briefly, it was a key issue that came up in our research on the impact of Brexit on minority, ethnic and migrant people here. It's also something we've picked up in our most recent policy recommendations in terms of people being denied access to healthcare, difficulty in accessing cross-border healthcare post-Brexit. And one thing we've set out that could be done is about clarifying rights and entitlements here, so people are aware what they're entitled to, and also, targeting service providers in the healthcare sector in terms of increasing awareness of understanding of this issue. So there's a number of practical measures we feel could be taken forward to address some of the concerns we heard.
We did make a number of specific recommendations as well, which are with government. So we're looking forward to having a positive response to those. But we'll keep you posted on that. Do we have any other? Yep.
Hi, I'm Alex Brennan from the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. I just had a question regarding the loss of the EU funding. And I know that in the report, and as you both said, that there's a particular impact on the women's sector and their ability to deliver services to many women, many of whom would be vulnerable. The Commission addressed the issue of the lack of equality screening on this Shared Prosperity Fund, I think when the fund was the beginning of the development of the fund and it being delivered in Northern Ireland. And I did see in the report that the Commission requested that the Department for Levelling Up be designated for the purposes of Section 75 in 2023 and still haven't gotten a response. And I suppose I was just curious if the Department was planning to renew the request with the new Secretary of State and if there has been any sort of equality screening of the Shared Prosperity Fund to date that the Commission has come across. Thank you.
I'll start this and then hand it over to Roisin, because I know, personally speaking to people within NIO, the request was put before the former Secretary of State on several occasions. And at one stage, I think it was Mr. Gove who said it wouldn't be appropriate to designate the department. That request has been put before the Secretary of State again and is being looked at. The department name has changed. I can't remember the specific title it gets now. But unfortunately, we fall between two stools. Our equality duties here don't apply, and yet we have no power to challenge the Westminster government in terms of how they applied equality duties. So we're seeking that be addressed before the next round of funding. And we are the only jurisdiction throughout the UK where decisions have been taken remotely from us by another body. And that is inappropriate. It's unfair to everyone who lives here. We actually asked that our own departments here in the civil service would have a bigger input into that, knowing what is really relevant to the people here in Northern Ireland. So we're hoping that things will change. There seems to be much more willingness and openness towards that whole equality and close to the ground in terms of how these decisions might be made. But I'm not holding my breath, but I will give you a commitment that we will continue to work with Northern Ireland Office on that regard. Roisin, you want to come in?
Obviously this has been, a key focus of our work in terms of how the loss of EU funding has impacted on equality groups here. And as you say, this had a particular impact on certain groups, including women's organisations as well as disabled organisations. And we're very concerned about how the UK Prosperity Fund was rolled out and the cliff edge that happened at the end of March, with many organisations not knowing till the very last minute whether or not they had funding or not. So we had set out a series of recommendations in advance of that, and we've now commissioned a new update report really to evaluate, well, what has the impact been, who has lost out, what could be done better this time, what lessons could be learnt from the last round of funding, mindful that another round is about to start next March. So we will be publishing that report in early January. We know this is something that a lot of groups here have actually helped us with and contributed to the research. But it's clear more could have been done in terms of equality being built into the last UK Shared Prosperity Fund in terms of really putting it at the heart of the whole programme. We put out a series of recommendations already about how that could be done, and obviously we will be informed by the next research report in terms of what more could be done and what lessons could be learned going forward. Okay.
We have an online question. Do you need me to read it out, or are you going to read it out?
No, I can read it out, yeah. There's a question here around pay transparency laws that should be expected to be implemented here by 2026. And the question is, what are the consequences should the government not implement this here, and what could the commissions do in that case, for example, bring legal cases?
Question. Just by way of context, both commissions have published a very detailed briefing paper on the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and we've made clear our views that we consider that the vast majority of the provisions in the EU Pay Transparency Directive should be transposed into Northern Ireland law by the deadline of June 2026, which is less than 2 years from now. So we're really saying action should be taken now. Consultation should begin on this. We are waiting for the views of government in terms of the response to that paper, in terms of the way forward. Clearly, we will be considering next steps if it becomes clear that the government doesn't share our views. There are a range of options open to the commissions that we would consider, including potential legal action, including we also have a power to raise matters with the Specialised Committee on the Protocol, so that is another option that is open to the Commission. So we will wait to see what the response of government is to our briefing paper, and then we will consider what's the appropriate next steps.
Is that all the online questions? Okay, I promised to run a tight ship, and I'm going to. So we have a panellists discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. We can move straight on to that, I think. So if I can ask the panellists to join us. So it's Kevin Hanratty, Sarah Craig and John Patrick Clayton. If you can come up, and I'm going to sit at the end.
Okay, welcome to our panellists. I'm going to start with John Patrick. John Patrick is a regional organiser with Unison, leading its public policy work in Northern Ireland. He is a member of the Northern Ireland Committee of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and he represents NICTU on the UK Domestic Advisory Group on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. a consultative body enabling government to hear from those most affected by the operation of the agreement. Beside John Patrick, we have Dr. Sarah Craig. She is a law lecturer at the University of Ulster and has also taught at Queen's. Sarah's research and teaching interests are in the area of international and EU refugee law, human rights, equality and gender. Sarah's PhD focused on solidarity within the common European asylum system, specifically looking at regional solidarity and fair sharing ambitions. Her recent focus has been on Brexit research, working with colleagues on 2 Equality Commission reports, the most recent with colleagues at Ulster University. And then we have, not last but not least, Kevin Hanratty, who is a director of the Human Rights Consortium, a coalition of around 160 civil society groups that campaign for a human rights-based society in Northern Ireland. The consortium campaigns, among other things, for the development of a strong and inclusive Bill of Rights. It undertakes education and advocacy work focused on the protection and promotion of human rights. And Kevin, you might be best placed to answer Emma's question that she asked a little while ago. What we're going to do with this panel is each of the panellists are going to give a short presentation, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for a question and answer session. I don't have any indication as to who wants to go first, so we'll just start at the end. John Patrick, do you want to go first?
Start at the other end.
Okay, Kevin, you've been nominated.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the 2 commissions for the invitation today. Well done on the launch of your annual report. It looks fantastic. I look forward to reading it. Particularly enthused by the recommendations around the Bill of Rights and some of the equality rights additions that need to be made in Northern Ireland. Can I congratulate the dedicated mechanisms, obviously on a what can only be described as a very successful year in terms of taking forward the Article 2 powers and refining and defining the scope of those protections for people in Northern Ireland. For us, at a civil society level, this has been a really, it's been a year where the Article 2 powers have really come into their own. We finally had the opportunity to see how these protections work in practice and work in reality to protect people on the ground. And that's what's really, has always been at the core of the Article 2 protections, that element of the Windsor Framework for us. And the result really is that Article 2 clearly has teeth. It has proven itself very capable of protecting existing standards. I think it's important to note that prior to this year, yes, we had some important rulings like the Spuck judgment that the Commission, had already established a series of tests that needed to be met to engage the Article 2 powers, and those were vindicated in that judgment. And that was a very important set of tests to establish. But this year we've really seen, I think, the tires hit the road in terms of testing the scope and the power of Article 2 once those tests are actively engaged. And this, unfortunately, has mostly been in response to a couple of pieces of legislation that, in our view, should have never seen the light of day, particularly the Legacy Act and the Illegal Migration Act. But before that, as Alison rightly pointed out, we had the Anguisham judgment, which was important in itself because it did establish that rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity section of the Good Friday Agreement wasn't set in stone in 1998, that it applied to everyone in the community, and that definition of everyone in the community was not rooted in traditional concepts of nationalists or unions people or people who were born here in 1998, but included refugees and asylum seekers. And that really importantly speaks to the universality of human rights for us and the importance of these protections. And likewise, it brought in the Charter of Fundamental Rights into the ambit of the Article 2 powers and various other important directives. And then, I suppose, flash forward to the start of this year, we had the Legacy Act judgment in the Dillon case. A very egregious piece of legislation in terms of many grounds, but the immunity from prosecution provisions were dismissed and rejected by all sections of society here. The case itself was important because, as Alison pointed out, not only was there a violation of Articles 2 and 3 in the Convention, but it really showed the power of the Article 2 protections within the Windsor Framework and a more immediate application in terms of remedies, whereby we saw a Section 4 declaration of incompatibility. Under Article 2, we saw those provisions actively disapplied and immediately disapplied. I think that speaks to the power of Article 2 moving forward in terms of protecting people on the ground. Again, we saw that replicated in the Illegal Migration Act, that again had an ECHR violation, but importantly also an Article 2 scope was brought into play, and numerous directives were seen to be violated under that case as well. I think if the current government hadn't have reversed its policy around the Rwanda policy, we might have also seen the Commission necessitated the Commission taking a case on largely similar grounds under that piece of legislation as well, and hopefully that never has to see the light of day. So I think those 2 or 3 cases in this year were fundamental to establishing not just the scope but the power of Article 2 in terms of addressing any regression in human rights and that non-diminution commitment, making it a reality really. And all these cases have been really important in testing the limits of Article 2, but our view is that all of this could have been avoided. Litigation is always the last port of call. We, other civil society organisations, pleaded with the government not to take forward the Rwanda scheme or their new approach to migration. Likewise, other organisations pleaded with them on similar grounds with the Legacy Act, but it fell on deaf ears, unfortunately. And that continues a trend that I think we've seen right from the start of these powers with the Nationality and Borders Bill and the Elections Act, where Article 2 implications were ignored. And I think to everyone's frustration, we've then had to see, and rightly so, the Commission take up the judicial review mechanism of challenging those mistakes. I think the dedicated mechanisms were obviously cautious in how and when they took the cases, but I think this year proved that those were the right cases at the right time and for the absolute perfect reason. So well done in that regard. I think this speaks, though, to a wider problem that Geraldine highlighted, that when the UK government and indeed the Northern Executive are developing policies, developing legislation, we need to see the Article 2 consideration rooted at the ground level, rooted in that early development process. And that's what we haven't seen to date over the last 3 or 4 years of Article 2 implementation. And hopefully we've turned a corner with this government, but as the 2 commissioners have rightly pointed out, this government now continues with litigation with an appeal process, not on the Convention grounds, but specifically on the Article 2 grounds for the Legacy Act and I think for the Illegal Migration Act as well. That is really worrying for us. As they claim, the idea behind that is to establish the scope and the extent of the Article 2 powers, our view is that we've had at least 4 or 5 cases now that have given very detailed evidence around what the extent of those powers are. So I think that's a mistake, and a mistake that we'll certainly be challenging with other organisations in civil society. I think, and I'll try and finish at this, but I think the earlier those considerations are built in, the easier it will be to implement and have the Article 2 powers accessible to everyone. And I speak to the Executive as much as Westminster as well, because we think we need more transparency around what's happening there as well. Because the outworkings of not doing that is that Article 2 then becomes politicised, and we see it criticised in the media, and that's not where we want it to be. Certainly at a civil society level, the next stage, I think, needs to be seeing community groups, seeing organisations actively using Article 2 themselves and using it to protect existing standards. So again, thank you to the Commission for all the hard work you've done the last year, and it's great to see Article 2 eventually hit the road and have some practical effect. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for that. Sarah, do you want to go next? Okay.
So morning everyone, and lovely to be part of the discussions taking place here today. Thank you specifically to all those involved, and really just to echo the same thoughts there towards the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland and the NIHRC, and for the comprehensive really snapshot of the complexities of what we're really dealing with regards to Article 2 of the Windsor Framework. Linked to this then, and the purpose, I believe, of this sort of the part of the panel discussions today is the question of how we really embed Article 2 in policy and lawmaking. And I'm going to focus my attention specifically here on the role of universities then, the collaborative role of academics within that space specifically, and I suppose, but but maybe most importantly then, the embedding of knowledge to the next generation of future solicitors, barristers, policy makers coming through our universities who will be dealing with those complexities that I think are very much apparent in the discussions that we've had already today. As I was putting sort of the final touches on the talk for today, the overarching theme really of all the points that I want to address, or at least I hope I'm going to address and put forward, is that of collaboration and the value of having a wide range of voices at the table, so to speak, when looking at the future of equality protection in Northern Ireland, and then specifically Article 2 matters on that. Having attended, a number of events related to equality protection and Article 2 the last few months alone, and even one that Kevin and the Human Rights Consortium took a lead on, I think what struck me the most really with those is the value of having collaboration really as we grapple with the challenges and opportunities of the legal limits of Article 2. Specifically now that we're really seeing the richness of the case law that we're starting to see coming through the courts and what has already been addressed so comprehensively already today. So, like I say, I'll focus my time here looking at what role universities then can play within this space, specifically touching on 2 points that I want to look at. The collaborative role of universities and academics in terms of, for instance, the research and reports to aid in that policy development space, like the event that's coming later today as well, and looking from the EU Charter side of things. And then secondly, really looking to how we can, as academics as well, how we can embed this research in the curriculum moving forward for our law students specifically. So firstly, looking at the collaborative role of academics to aid policy developments and maybe specifically targeted research. I think it's clear to note that Article 2 and what has been addressed and everyone in this room is aware of is a complex provision to unpack, as evidenced not only from the remarks that are sort of there today in the annual report, but also then the need for specific areas of research. So the reports on specifically on refugee rights or the EU Charter, for example. So really coming back to that role of collaboration, we can see that there is that wealth of knowledge and insights across all aspects of the post-Brexit landscape within our academic institutions, ranging from EU post-Brexit trade specialism, and then specifically those with maybe expertise specifically on Article 2 matters for relevance today. And that extends far beyond the institutions of solely Queen's and Ulster as well within the Northern Ireland context. But we can see from many of the reports that have been commissioned as well and collaborated with both commissions. This collaboration has come from a vast range of academic institutions, both within the island of Ireland itself and across the water. And as we navigate the scope and understanding of Article 2 of the Windsor Framework and what that really means in practice, the opportunity for that collaborative role to help aid policy developments alongside the commissions through targeted research could really not be understated, I think. There are, however, a couple of points I'm mindful of noting when noting the role of research taking place within a university setting and in conjunction with the commissions. Firstly, not to be exclusionary then, there has been fantastic research that has been done by legal scholars outside the traditional, quote-unquote university setting. And I'm thinking of the research completed by legal practitioners, such as the work of Alison Harvey and the Article 2 refugee matters there. And I think that goes back to that collaborative heart, really, of what I was advocating, which is essential for the goal of a richer understanding of what Article 2 actually then entails. And that's just something I was sort of mindful of as I was writing this. And as with any piece of research, I think specifically involving the very fast-paced nature of Article 2 at present and the case law, one of the major challenges, I suppose, from that research side of things is providing timely accounts of what is actually taking place. On the academic side, I'm thinking of the work of Colin Murray and Anurag, who's, I think, Anurag's speaking later on today, which brings to mind to a continued source of academic insight through academic blogs, for example. But the point which I've maybe sort of slightly strayed from there is the potentially the trade-offs that we have with, say, commissioned or collaborative research, ensuring that it's up to date as possible, but mindful of the fact that there will always be that sort of cut-off point, especially when it is such a fast-paced and moving environment. And the second point really of the discussions that I wanted to note is the embedding of research within our law curriculum at universities themselves. In addition to unpacking the complexities of Article 2 from the university perspective then, there's that dual focus of research linked to our teaching at the very core, and this is then being built into the curriculum itself and design in terms of educating the next generations, like I said, of lawyers, graduates, or those involved in policy work. Specifically then, there's a couple of points which I want to make with regards to this when examining some of the key ways in which Brexit research relates to wider considerations in the provision of university legal education. And we can maybe unpack in a little bit more detail with dealing with sort of those challenges and opportunities. But firstly, I think it has been underscored through the discussions today that this is an inherently multifaceted area and one which is continuing to evolve at such a fast pace. And although that might be a very obvious point to point out, I think the focus on certain matters is then uniquely tied to that Northern Ireland context as well. And whilst there are many academics undertaking research outside of the setting, of course, the point I'm tentatively putting forward really is that the importance of this within the curriculum within the Northern Ireland context as well could potentially differ from that from across other jurisdictions for law students. And sort of to put my final point then, whilst of course Article 2 matters may be briefly covered in the curriculum in core modules, such as constitutional law, EU law, when dealing with the post-Brexit landscape, the very specific nature and the fact that we're all here today still grappling with the confines of what Article 2 means, this provision somewhat lends itself a little bit to more detailed discussions outside maybe the core curriculum of law schools. And that sometimes lends itself to really detailed discussions within optional module settings, for example. To give a clear example of that, within the context I'm most familiar with it at Ulster, Article 2 specifically is discussed within a couple of classes in optional undergraduate equality law modules and also on LLM Masters Equality Law modules. But again, sort of just recognising that optional element of it, not necessarily completely focused on the core side of things. The concern being then that whilst endeavouring to immerse students with a nuanced understanding of Article 2, it's plausible that many could end up not studying it in any great detail due to not, selecting specific optional modules within that. And this, of course, is subject to change, and the syllabus changes continually year after year. And I think actually speaking with a colleague this morning as well was interesting that I think with the new case law that is developing in the Northern Ireland context, there is more impetus really to start with the case law and then link that through the legal confinements of what Article 2 entails. And I think that was just sort of something to flag really early on as sort of the important role that we as academics and as law schools need to do in continuing to strive to educate sort of the next generation and incorporate Article 2 within our law schools. So in terms of time, I'll maybe leave it there. Just some elements from a university perspective when we think of embedding Article 2 within the Northern Ireland context. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Move on to John Patrick, and your time has finally come.
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you to the Commissions for the invitation. Apologies that I was slightly late and missed some of the earlier presentations. I was at a not completely unrelated meeting about situations some migrant workers face in social care. So I suppose an example of how the ripples and the ripple effect of EU exit still continues to be felt across a whole range of different areas. I think today is a very timely event, a very important event. I look forward to diving into this report in greater detail and using the report. And in her introduction, Geraldine explained that part of my role is to represent the NI Committee of ICTU on the UK's Domestic Advisory Group on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the Article 2 considerations are issues that I have brought forward in that space, and the work of the Commissions has been invaluable in that regard, and I've had the opportunity to engage with colleagues across the Commissions in relation to that, and hope to continue to do so, and I'll touch on that a little bit more through the course of my remarks. I suppose at a very basic level, the work the Commissions do around Article 2 and the work that we as civic society hope to do alongside them in relation to Article 2 is really fundamental to the trade union movement, because the protection and promotion of human rights, the promotion of equality of opportunity are fundamental trade union values. And we really want to see the Article 2 commitments being embedded, as Kevin said, in relation to policy making. If necessary, litigation being taken to protect people's rights and enhance people's rights. But we know there's a significant amount of work to do, and I think we want to work with the Commissions across trade unions to try and help us do that. As I recall from the email I got from Claire McCann, I think we've been asked to discuss challenges and opportunities. So I'm maybe in a more optimistic mood than normal, so I'll try and start with some opportunities if I can, and then maybe move on to some challenges. As others have reflected on, we do have a change of government at Westminster. I think they are being quite conspicuous in their efforts to try and emphasise a resetting of relations with the EU. Let's see how substantive that proves to be, and how much that impacts positively in relation to the protection of rights and in relation to the issues around Article 2. But there very clearly does seem to be an effort underway from the UK government to do that, and notably with the Irish government as well. We are seeing clear signals of support and commitment in a very welcome way to international obligations in the ECHR. But again, let's see how deep those actually run. Let's see how those statements are backed up by actions down the line. There is as well some opportunity perhaps presented in the fact that compared to this time last year, we do have an executive back in place, we have an assembly back in place, and there is some movement on areas that would link to the Article 2 commitments and to the protection of employment rights in particular through the ongoing consultation at the moment about the Good Jobs Employment Bill. And I'm sure both commissions have been very heavily engaged and are considering those proposals in great detail. And they will have some impact on advancing rights protections in this area more generally. But how they interact with the Article 2 commitments, how they interact with the Pay Transparency Directive, for example, are the kinds of issues we will be raising as Congress. And a particular area of EU law that is developed in this space that we will be keen to see reflected in the proposals that are put forward by the executive and in legislation going forward is how the progress at the EU level around collective bargaining, around the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive and the requirements it places on member states to put in place action plans to enhance collective bargaining coverage across those member states, how those sorts of proposals, which obviously will have effect in the south, will translate into action in Northern Ireland as well. So those are the broad policy areas that we're reflecting on and we can see some opportunities in. In relation to the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and particularly its provisions around the level playing field, and also its references to the ECHR and the references it makes to the ECHR throughout, but I suppose in relation to judicial cooperation and law enforcement are some of the more specific references I can recall. In relation to how those level playing field commitments are implemented with regards to Northern Ireland, something I and other members of the UK's Domestic Advisory Group and indeed the EU's Domestic Advisory Group have been keen to highlight to both the UK Government and to the EU Commission is that when applying those commitments or assessing how those commitments have been applied in relation to Northern Ireland, we have to think about the interaction with Article 2 and it should be seen through the lens of Article 2. And we've made some repeated statements drawing on the work of the Commissions to that effect about the importance of doing that. The UK DAG is, I believe, going into its third year of operation, or perhaps this is where your maths deserts you. Very simple maths that it is. It's been in place since 2022. Is probably the simpler way to put it. But anyway, it last year produced its first annual report of priority issues, and Windsor Framework implementation around Article 2 was something that we highlighted in that context, and so it's something that'll continue, I hope, to be a theme of the Domestic Advisory Group's work going forward. There is a review of implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in 2026. There's obviously changes at the EU Commission level as well, so that possibly represents an opportunity to press for greater recognition and greater protection for rights in Northern Ireland and across the UK more generally. I suppose another opportunity that we've seen come forward over this last 18 months or so is greater recognition of the role of civic society around the implementation of the Windsor Framework and monitoring the implementation of the Windsor Framework. And Kevin, I know, has been involved in that work in relation to taking forward the actual civic engagement structures and allowing a focus not just on the obviously very important issues around trade and around the impacts on business and the economy, but those issues that impact on civic society and particularly the rights issues. And I think those structures are starting to get more embedded and hopefully will help to flag up these sorts of issues with the UK government and the EU down the line too. The challenges, I suppose, others have already reflected on to a large extent. We don't obviously have the Bill of Rights, as everyone knows. Contextually, that obviously leaves us in a weaker position in terms of rights protections going forward. We don't have progress in a Single Equality Act. I know Roisin earlier, and I think Geraldine made reference to the inquiry that the Executive Office Committee is undertaking at the moment. So all of those are matters that we need to continue to progress on and campaign on, as Kevin alluded to. The litigation, the ongoing litigation with regards to the Dillon case is concerning from our perspective, and we've raised that concern with Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's the Minister, I suppose, who has most directly his responsibility in terms of European Union matters now within the Cabinet, and also it's been raised by Congress with the NIO and their initial engagements with them since the change in government. And I would share Kevin's view that there have been some clear decisions and judgments given already with regard to this, and the concern is not so much that the UK government is seeking to further explore the effect of the provisions. The worry is that do we end up potentially with weaker forms of protection as a consequence of all this, and I don't think that's what anyone wants to see. Another point that we've been considering at the UK DAG level, and I suppose it goes to the very welcome engagement the Commissions have had with bodies like Congress, is how we actually guard against, I suppose, what you can almost describe as passive divergence, the inevitable divergence that happens whenever the UK has left the EU and whenever we're not as linked into its systems or even around policy development or being able to scan ahead into the future about what directives or regulations might come forward at the EU level that could be beneficial in terms of enhancing rights and equality protections here. And that's an ongoing piece that I think the Irish Congress as a whole will have to be engaged in, because it obviously still has engagement with the European institutions in relation to the situation in the South. And I suppose finally that the most obvious one that people have already referred to is the Pay Transparency Directive issue. Gender pay reporting, the lack of gender pay reporting in this place in Northern Ireland has been a significant concern for some time. We've had commitments to put it in place. They have not been followed through. We now have this very clear, I think, imperative coming forward as a result of Article 2 to move on that, and we obviously will be pressing that with the relevant executive departments as well. Final thoughts then from me in terms of maybe what government and the commissions, I suppose, can continue to do to support trade unions and other stakeholders. Outside of the continued collective push I think we all need to engage in around the Bill of Rights and to raise this with the new UK government and to highlight that it's a priority unfinished action from our Good Friday Agreement, is that need, I think, for further discussions, seminars, continued engagement like this. As Kevin has already said, he took the words out of my mouth. Sorry, Kevin, that's the risk of asking you to go first. Litigation should be the measure of last resort. This should be reflected at policy development stage. It should be considered from the earliest possible stage, similar to what we hope would be done with the Section 75 duties, for example. We should not get to the stage where government has to be warned of the consequences of litigation. It should be factored in from the very earliest stage and reflected in what is done by government to give effect to its obligations under Article 2. So happy to answer any questions people might have, and thank you once again to the Commissions for the invitation today.
Well, thank you to all three of our panellists. Very insightful views on where we are and what needs to happen. But I'm going to open the floor now for questions. So if you have a question for any of our panellists, can you just put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. They weren't that quiet whenever it was asking questions of us. Anyone online? No? I'm not letting you three get away that easy, so I have a few questions for myself. Kevin, can I ask you, what are you hoping to see from the new government and the executive in terms of actual engagement with civic society? How can we sort of formalise that approach on the whole range of equality and human rights issues here in Northern Ireland? Not just on Article 2 per se, but also on the wider cross-border issues as well as divergence.
Okay, thanks very much, Geraldine. I think, well, I'll try and start with our Article 2. And brief reference to what I said before, I think the difficulty is that we don't have a clear pathway in terms of early consideration of it at a ground level, and that's certainly the case in Westminster. I think for Stormont, the same question could be applied. We work regularly with committees and with MLAs, but even I'm not exactly sure how Article 2 is embedded in that early policy and legislative development processes. Now, the obvious sort of focus or group or committee that lies with is the Executive Office and the Executive Office Review Committee. But I think it's similarly a duty that could lie across all committees and all ministers and all departments. And I think you referenced one screening exercise that was done last year. That seems to be largely the exception rather than the rule. So I think there's a body of work there to mainstream it across all the work up at the executive, and clearly the dedicated mechanisms will have a key role, I think, in doing that. I think that speaks to a larger awareness issue and a larger training issue that does exist, and it's not just at a public servant, civil service, MLA level. It's replicated at a community voluntary sector level as well, because don't forget that this is not a sort of simple area of law. It is quite a complex area. It is a complex set of tests that need to be met to even firstly engage these standards. So I think there's more that we can do, more that civil society generally can do to sort of create awareness among our members about how they apply, how they possibly could apply, and how they could apply to issues on the ground. I think linked to that, there's a core question of funding, though. The funding for these pots of post-Brexit work are ever decreasing. So I think, there's also an attitudinal thing, I think, as well, in the sense that people have quite a lot of Brexit fatigue, in that they think that's done and dusted. Periodically, these issues are revisited either through the court cases or other measures, but I think there is still a need to educate people about how these duties work in effect, and how people can actually claim and exercise the rights, be it in collaboration with the dedicated mechanisms or other groups, because it can't just be a duty that is within the remit of legal experts or solicitors' firms. If we want it to be effective, we have to actually have community groups and civil society organisations actively raising it on a day-to-day basis. So that's one thing that could be done, and I think that integration across Stormont as well is quite important. Looking forward, I think, to the issues that John Patrick raised around some of the next step in terms of, we've had the cases this year on non-domination, but it seems that the keeping pace elements are going to be the next, I don't want to use the word battle, but It might be because we have the Pay Transparency Directive and the Directive around equality bodies. We have a slight concern that because the pace of things in Northern Ireland is so glacial, that 2026 is, will be upon us very, very quickly. And we're sort of keen to see what can be done. I have a concern in terms of processes, in terms of that engagement you talk about, that even at an EU level, we could see more happening. I think, the directive has been voted, has been passed, and it seems that now at this stage the EU are considering how it applies, how the Article 2 duties apply to it. It seems to me there is also a point that at which the EU could better integrate the Article 2 considerations earlier on in their processes, in the same way that we're asking the UK government to do. So I think there's an issue there, so that these processes can be sped up. And I do have a concern. I think someone raised the question: what happens if it's not agreed at a UK level? That is a concern for many people, because again, going back to this point, it politicises these issues that should not be politicised. In terms of the wider point about human rights and equality and how people can engage in it, I think civil society, our sector back teeth, have been engaged in one respect, but we've been ignored. Is the problem? We've had a 25-plus year history here of telling elected representatives, the UK government, the Irish government, of what additional rights and equality standards we need in Northern Ireland. The answer is there in the original document. We need a Bill of Rights. We have our European Convention on Human Rights, but we've spent the last 14 years defending those set of standards from a government that was only really interested in regression and bashing human rights. Hopefully we've turned a corner in terms of those attitudes at a UK level. But what we need is actually the delivery of what we were promised 26, 27 years ago, in the form of a Bill of Rights, a comprehensive Bill of Rights. The evidence is there. We actually now need to move to delivery. So hopefully that partially answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. We, as both commissions, have been very keen that there would be engagement between the EU and civil society as well, and that there would be that dual communication, that would actually be meaningful engagement, that you would have the opportunity to say yourselves what's going well and what's not working so well. Anyone have a question from either the floor or online? You have to fill the time between now and 5 to 1, or you're not getting your lunch. One online.
We've got two online. The first is from Roisin at CJI. He said, sorry if this is how she might have missed this, but I'm aware that the EU Victims' Rights Directive has been reviewed with amendments proposed. Would amendments made to the directive post-Brexit apply in Northern Ireland?
Okay, Roisin, do you want to take that, or Claire?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. I actually think might fall more with your work, Roisin, in terms of divergence. Essentially, we haven't identified it as amending one of the Annex 1 equality directives, and that's where that keeping pace obligation arises. Having said that, we've done a lot of work where we're looking at this issue about equivalence of rights and divergence on the island. So where there is that risk of divergence on the island, we're calling for Northern Ireland law to be amended on a voluntary basis. It's not a requirement of Article 2, but to ensure best practice, to ensure enhancements of rights, and that we align with international standards. I don't know if you have anything to add, Roisin.
Okay, thank you for that. I didn't think it was fair to ask any of you three panellists on the intricacies of assessing EU directives. I think that's what the two teams are for. Do you want to give us the next question?
Yeah, the next question is from Una at CAJ, who's asked, outside of litigation, has there been any engagement from the new UK government on improving compliance with Article 2 in future legislation, for example, embedding Article 2 considerations in explanatory memoranda?
I know both Roisin and Ailish have been involved in working directly with officials in Whitehall about the memoranda. Do either of you two want to address it? I think Ailish is actually gone. Is she? Oh, she's there? Roisin, go ahead.
Okay. Well, with the previous UK government, we had raised a number of issues in terms of further embedding consideration of Article 2 into policy making and processes. including about updating guidance, for example. And I think Geraldine had mentioned it in her initial speech. There has been some progress on that, but we're seeking clarity in terms of some of our other recommendations about, for example, the guidance for statutory instruments and getting that embedded into that very key document for policymakers. So we haven't heard anything from the new UK government in terms of their approach to that. We do have regular meetings with the Northern Ireland office where we have the opportunity to raise some of these concerns. But we will be pressing the UK government, the new UK government, on this issue to see if there's either more work planned or a change of approach. And I think also Kevin very helpfully mentioned about the need to embed it into stormont processes and procedures, and we have a series of recommendations that we will be raising with the Assembly in terms of how that could be embedded into, say, consultations, into new bills, into explanatory memorandum, etc. So, yeah, we've been taking forward a range of work there.
Any other questions from the floor? Okay, Sarah, can I just ask you one question? You've been heavily involved in carrying out the research into the divergence of equality and human rights here on the island of Ireland. What, for you, are the biggest areas of risk, the biggest impact in that terms of divergence? Or what do you fear most?
The big question that you've asked. I know. Sorry. I think a lot of it has already been sort of addressed there today. That aspect of not having a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland really is sort of the focal point of really most of the discussions that we keep coming back to time and time again. And I think that really should be sort of the core area that we really now do focus on. And I know that yourselves as the commissions have been quite vocal in that and going forward. So I think from my perspective, I think that really is it as well. From my work, I suppose, on some of those reports as well, I think it's about highlighting as well how we need to sort of as well keep on top of the Court of Justice case law too. That is a really big aspect that it's sort of easy to track when we're linking it to the Annex 1 directives. Beyond that, it is a massive sort of task that we're really looking at, and sort of I think that potentially could be a difficulty moving forward. Just how do we keep on top of all of this moving forward?
I think that's a really important point. You know, the very fact that the government are sort of challenging through the appeal process of potentially the scope of Article 2. Then whenever we're trying to encourage a voluntary alignment as new directives come on board or as others change, I think that's going to be a big challenge for all of us moving forward. Alison, do you have anything you want to add?
One thing, it's the irony that strikes me that with the Good Friday Agreement, the relevance of divergence of rights was that Ireland was to up its game and meet Northern Ireland, which was then seen as being slightly ahead in terms of rights protection. That's no longer the case. It's now us playing catch-up. So the Irish have done in my non-political opinion, have done a very good job in bringing rights protections up to a level which we can only be envious of, I think. So that's an irony that's not lost on me. We're now the other side of the commitment, and I think we need to do better. But we're hoping that this new government is going to do that.
Do any of our panellists have anything further they would like to say, having heard the others speak and some of the questions? Yes, go ahead.
Just in response, just a couple of the questions so far. I think something that, from the IC2 perspective, we've pressed on with all departments and with the executive over a long period is we don't really have a form of social dialogue here, or a comprehensive form of social dialogue here. And we could go back into the past in relation to things like the Civic Forum and everything else, and things that didn't really get embedded into our structures of government. We see it across some departments, across some policy areas, across some proposals or consultation documents, and a move toward co-production, co-design. But just to the points Kevin made in response to your question about what more government could do to sort of embed Article 2, I think that shift in mindset toward more of a social dialogue approach would be very beneficial in this space as well. And actually how we can use the devolved powers that we have in Northern Ireland to have more progressive rights frameworks in place, I think is important, and something that we've been reflecting on over this last number of years. We've seen attempts by the previous UK government around things like the Minimum Services Level Act to weaken rights, trade union rights, and the right to strike, for example. Those are now going to be repealed, and those raise issues from a trade union perspective in relation to the level playing field. So we haven't had those in Northern Ireland because those rights were devolved to Northern Ireland, and when we didn't see similar moves made here. But it's just by way of an example of where stronger social dialogue can actually help to mitigate impacts as well, and just something to reflect on. And I think just in response to the risk of divergence across both jurisdictions on the island, I had mentioned the collective bargaining piece, and obviously that's very important for us across both jurisdictions on this island and Congress, because we should see some movement by the Irish government to respond to that directive, for it to actually put action plans in place about how to enhance collective bargaining coverage, which is vitally important in terms of economic development and vitally important for workers across all sectors of the economy. We'd like to see the same sorts of approaches put in place in Northern Ireland, and it's something we'll be seeking through the new employment rights legislation. So it's an example maybe that's something we're aware of. I suppose the big fear is always the unknown, as Sarah is saying, a change in interpretation at the EU level, and whether we're sufficiently geared up to deal with that.
Thanks for that. Would you like to come in, Kevin?
Yeah, sorry, just a quick comment. I think part of the difficulty with Article 2 and how we perceive it is that it would be a mistake to see Article 2 as progressing rights somehow. Article 2 is about holding on to what we had on exit day, largely, in terms of that non-diminution principle. Yes, there's the keeping pace directive, but only applies to six directives. I think what we need to look at is attitudes to, if Article 2 is being challenged, if there is this view that we need to test it further in the courts, why is that? If we have people crying out around, some voices saying, "Oh, we can't diverge from what the rest of the UK is doing, or it needs to be a UK-wide piece of legislation." These arguments are raised periodically when it suits the political agenda of some groups. We didn't hear those voices being raised when we had differences in equality and human rights legislation going back many years. And the precise reason why we had the Article 2 protections were necessary was that in the past 25 years, the only source of elevation in terms of human rights and equality protections either came from the UK government, and the abortion and equal marriage legislation is an example of that, or from the various directives that came from the EU. If we had been waiting on the Stormont executive to lift to raise the tide in terms of human rights and equality, we would be waiting an awful long time, because simply it has been impossible at an executive level for them to agree on additional human rights standards because of whatever ideological, historical debates. And that's precisely why Article 2 needs to be seen for what it is. It is really important, and really we should protect it at all costs, but it is about holding ground. And the failure of our mandatory coalition to progress human rights is precisely why we need additional standards. We need that Bill of Rights to come into play. So I think that some people have said about the Article 2 provisions being advancing of progressing rights and being, particular to Northern Ireland. Yes, it's particular to Northern Ireland. It's asymmetric. Our colleagues across the UK are crying out for it. If the UK government want to reset relationships with the EU, by all means, raise the tide for everyone, apply those standards across the UK. Everyone would welcome that. But I think criticism of Article 2 as if it's sort of somehow advancing us beyond what we had it doesn't make sense. We need to progress a Bill of Rights to do that, and that way it was fundamentally rooted in the peace process and the agreement. So I think there's some perceptual difficulties with Article 2 from some quarters as well that need to be clarified.
Rory.
Thank you very much. And two questions, if I may, and they do sort of chime a bit with some of the themes that Kevin was just raising there. One, when we talk about developments in the EU, when we talk about the Pay Transparency Directive, Gender Balance in Boards Directive, Adequate Minimum Wages Directive, and so on, a lot of these are clearly examples where the EU is progressing human rights beyond existing standards. But I sometimes wonder if we, including myself, sometimes look at the EU with rose-tinted glasses. You know, there's some areas where the EU hasn't made any progress, like equality in relation to goods, facilities and services, in areas like age discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination for years now. There's been a proposal and no progress on that. And it's not unimaginable that the EU could actually regress legislation and human rights standards. Is there a need to be just concerned about how we look at what comes from Europe and be a bit critical about it, as well as wanting to take the best that comes from Europe? And the second question is in relation to the Bill of Rights debate. There have been some suggestions over the years of looking to how Scotland and Wales have sought to give subnational protection to international human rights standards through the Scottish incorporation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child recently, and before that, in a different version, the Welsh measure on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Ireland's version of Section 75, their equalities duty is a public sector equality and human rights duty. So there are other models beyond the classic Bill of Rights model for giving greater protection to international human rights, and I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on whether those are viable ways forward, given the difficulty it seems in progressing a classic Bill of Rights.
Who would like to go?
I'm happy to respond initially. I think Rory's absolutely right. There are, the second question first, there are different ways of advancing rights. We obviously have the proposal for our own Bill of Rights and peace process here, but there are other options. I think we get asked this question periodically about, well, could we not advance with a UK Bill of Rights? Absolutely, you could. But the trajectory we've been on for the last 25 years is that the UK government absolutely are not there, and have not historically seen the relevance of the need for that. We would love that to change. Lots of our colleagues across the UK are campaigning for that and the incorporation of various international treaties. But that would miss out the particularities of Northern Ireland. That wouldn't necessarily, unless it's done very, very well, would miss out the particularities of our local circumstances and the needs that need addressed here. And there are, as we know, very specific human rights needs in Northern Ireland. Not least of which is the point I already made around the mandatory coalition and its inability so far to agree on very much around human rights and equality. That said, I do think the Scottish and Welsh models are to be commended, certainly in terms of taking forward the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There seems to be a slight roadblock with the Human Rights Bill. The Scottish Government have delayed it somewhat, and our colleagues in Scotland are quite frustrated with that, but hopefully that will move forward soon. But the proposal in that is quite positive because it incorporates several of the international treaties into domestic legislation. There's absolutely nothing to stop our executive taking forward a similar pathway, and that could run parallel with our own Bill of Rights process. But the difficulty, again, is the political impediments and the vetoes that exist in our system of government that have never allowed anything to progress of that nature. There is also the added difficulty of the Supreme Court judgment around the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Scotland, which severely limits the scope of what can be done domestically within devolved within the Scottish Parliament, and that same judgment may have an impact on what could be done domestically in Wales or Northern Ireland if we were to go down that line. And I think that's why historically we have put, going back to what it says in the Good Friday Agreement, a Westminster piece of legislation would circumvent some of those difficulties, but also would be applied to the reserve powers of the UK government as they apply in Northern Ireland. So I think there's that we would be very reticent to move away from what the Good Friday Agreement says, precisely because it has been so difficult to advance anything here in Northern Ireland, and the strengths of a piece of Westminster legislation are well evidenced. And I think the other question around being cautious, absolutely. I think we need to be cautious about just blindly adopting legislation from anywhere. And I think there are good examples globally, regionally, European-wide that could be adopted locally. It's just, again, it goes back to that question of political will.
Yeah, for a point, quickly, it's mostly with regards to your sort of point there on the rose-tinted glasses point from the EU side of things, and I also work specifically on the Common European Asylum System and the sort of the lack of reform there, and all of the real critique that we can see from that side of thing. And I think what we're really seeing, but in the Northern Ireland context, when we're looking at sort of the quality protection standard, is the clear attempt at regression of the rights, really, of what we're having. And I suppose maybe just to make that slight distinction of, we're talking of regression there, but sometimes what we're seeing is when we look at the EU side of things as well, it can be that there's stagnation, not necessarily regression. And obviously there can be regression there, but I think a lot of the critique that we're voicing at that there hasn't been the potential for change. There hasn't been reform really in that area, and I think sort of the slight difference is maybe that in the Northern Ireland context we're really seeing that sort of really clear attempt at the regression of rights rather than that we're sort of it's stagnant in that regard. So.
Thanks. And I just wanted to pick up on the first question from Rory as well, because I think Kevin has dealt with the second question to a large degree. Other maybe than just say in relation to the second question, even in something like the new employment legislation, we would obviously be highlighting to the Department for Economy the need for them to look at ILO conventions and various international obligations in that regard as well. And if there's an opportunity to give them effect in law in Northern Ireland through that, then that's absolutely to be welcomed. I think it's a completely fair comment about not being using the rose-tinted glasses, to use your expression, in relation to everything that comes through in legislation from Europe. And I think in a sense that probably reflects the challenge that we have now because of the particular circumstances that Northern Ireland finds itself in. We have to be mindful of the political currents within Europe as well, and we've just gone through European parliamentary elections, which obviously would raise concern for many of us, I'm sure, in relation to some of the results we saw coming through on that front as well. So I think we do have to be conscious of that. I suppose for us in particular, from a Congress perspective, the challenge is engagement at the EU level, in that we will still have the opportunity to engage at the EU level in relation to proposals that would have an impact on the Republic of Ireland. But then we also now have to ask this additional question of what implications are there, if any, for Northern Ireland? How does Article 2 impact? Or is it something that we could look to progress and say, yes, that sort of change should be reflected in Northern Ireland law? That would strengthen the employment rights framework or the equality law framework. So we're going to have to apply quite a few additional tests in a sense. And it might go back to that point that we made earlier on about civic engagement with the EU institutions going forward as well, a way for us to be aware of what the legislative agenda is at the EU level over the period of several years, and how we can begin to scan as to what impact, if any, that should have here.
Thank you, Alison. Yeah, just to echo most of what's been said, but I think certainly the EU is not perfect. Nobody would suggest it is. It's reactive the same way most countries are. It's having its wave of populism as well, which it's having to deal with. But it has served us pretty well in this part of the world. And what was recognised, I think, in the Good Friday Agreement and in the Windsor Framework was that EU has underpinned almost all the positive developments we've seen. And the Windsor Framework doesn't mean if they go back, we have to go back with them. It's just that we will keep pace with positive advancements. So it's very much a positive thing in terms of, and also I think the EU was seen as that external guardian of our rights, as not being Irish or Northern Irish or British, and it's sitting above. The UK has a Bill of Rights. I think it really has the Human Rights Act. and people started seeing it as that when there was talk of getting rid of it. What we need here is something, and it was the reason that the Bill of Rights was talked about for here was that we have slightly different enhanced needs given our conflict, and that's not being met by the Human Rights Act. But we can develop, and the courts could develop more quickly here than elsewhere if necessary. But the Human Rights Act is a Bill of Rights of sorts, but it does not fill that special place that Northern Ireland has and also was promised, as Kevin says. And promising and then not delivering has a consequence in and of itself. So it's not good to make promises, especially not as part of a peace agreement, and then to simply let them die on the vine.
We can all live in hope that the UK government that we have currently will have a more positive approach to the whole aspect of human rights. Eilish, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just have a question. Sorry, it's not too cheeky. A question for the room rather than the panel. Just wondering, having thought about today, what, if anything, anybody might be prepared to share with us about how your work has changed in light of Windsor Framework Article 2, or how you've tried to go about integrating it or managing it into your work. And secondly, what, if anything, you might want to say to us today about how we work better and further with you. I mean, we've very much committed to the collaborative approach, as we know, but if there are particular ideas you have, it'd be interesting to hear them today. Thanks.
Anyone would like the microphone? In 4 minutes. But there is an opportunity. There's some refreshments available after this, so if you'd like to take the time to sort of network and have a conversation, if you don't want to take the floor, that's more than welcome. Have you any other questions? No? Okay, well then I'm going to just thank you all for engaging, and most importantly to thank our panellists. They have been very knowledgeable and very enlightening, and it's been really interesting to hear you talk and share your views. So over to Alison now, just to close and wind up.
You'd be delighted to know all I'm going to say is very few words. Thank you so much to everybody who's come and who's followed us online. Thank you very much to Sarah, to John Patrick, to Kevin, to Roisin, Eilish, Claire, to Alan, our AV support, real stalwart, and to the University of Ulster for hosting us. We have another event this afternoon. Some of you may be staying around for that. There is some refreshment available. I don't think you have to stay for the afternoon to avail of it, do you? Or are we? I think we should. It's a tax, maybe. You have to prove you're going to stay around. But thank you so much. It's been we see this as being really positive. It's helped us an awful lot, and it helps us really focus and gives us a bit of impetus, I think, moving forward. Just last thing I will say is we have asked for a response to this report from government, so we will be keeping on them, and we'll look forward to what they say in response to it, and we'll share that with you. So thanks so much, everybody, and if you're not joining us this afternoon, safe home and keep in touch with us.